All right, this next video focuses on the language of architecture. I hope this one's pretty quick. I'm going to go through some different styles and also focus on different regions where these types of styles tended to be popular or proliferate, and we see it in lots of examples. So our first example is considered the most basic form of architecture, which is load-bearing architecture, but the example we see here is actually quite complex in terms of how it was executed. So this is sometimes called El Castillo, or the Temple of Kukulkan, and so this was a temple created in the late Mayan period. So it's in southern Mexico today, and this at the site of Chichén Itza. So this is, as I said, in southern Mexico. You can see that it's a large temple construction with a structure on top. There are stairwells on all four sides. It is a stepped pyramid, but essentially with load-bearing architecture, you have stones on top of stones or building material on top of building material. Here, there are some chambers to take you down into a temple or ritual space, but for the most part, it is a solid construction. So that's the idea of load-bearing architecture. As I said, this is a pretty complex construction. Let me just scooch this over a little. This is a pretty complex construction, and so you can see how it has these very precise execution of the stone or masonry. Very famously at the spring and fall equinoxes, you get this effect of a slithering serpent going along the side of the stairwell here, which leads to the snake's head, relating to Kukulkan, or the idea of the feathered serpent. So you have the Kukulkan event in March and September at the equinoxes. If it's very cloudy, it's harder to get this effect, but the photo here gives you a nice sense of that slithering quality. Something that reveals the Mayans were often revealed for their understanding of numbers, and this structure is also related to that concept. So here you can see that there are 91 steps on each of the four staircases. You multiply that by 4, you get 364. And so for archaeologists and historians and art historians, they thought, wow, this is really close to the exact number of days in the year. So this idea of the Mayan awareness of numbers and of the calendar. And so if you add the temple on top, this top platform, you get 365. So you actually get the full number of days in the year, which is a wonderful way of seeing how they had a great conception of time and space. As I mentioned, so load-bearing architecture tends to be just stone on top of stone, but a lot of times in these types of pyramidal constructions, you would have a stairwell leading to a chamber. In the case of the Great Pyramids in Egypt, it's a burial chamber, but in the case of this one, it's more of a ritual chamber, the scholars believe. So you have a very small stairway that leads down, and then you have a chamber that has a chokmul, which is connected to offerings. So you have a reclining figure that tends to often have like an area for offerings, sometimes a bowl on its chest, and we see this in Aztec culture too. So that's down there. People can no longer go up these stairs. So tourists used to be able to go up them, but it's no longer possible. And then I think you also used to be able to go down into the Castillo. I think I've had students who've gone down a long time ago, but no longer. Maybe if you do a special tour. So Chichén Itza is in a site where there's a lot of what's called cenotes, or these kind of sinkholes or watering holes. So these are large water holes. If you ever go down to southern Mexico, or maybe you've been there before, you could do tours which involve visiting cenotes. And so the cenotes that were associated with Mayan culture were sometimes the recipients or kind of places where they would make offerings. And so they would throw things into the cenote. They would throw these offerings to the gods. And so you can see a sacred cenote as part of the site of Chichén Itza. But what's interesting is there's also a cenote underneath this very temple. So this idea of perhaps communing or connecting with the divine through that cenote. Because you would think, why would you build on top of a sinkhole? That would be very dangerous. But this idea of connecting to the divine would be very important. And it's a little bit off to the side of the center of the Castillo, or the temple. So here you can see the Castillo. You can see that it's part of this large complex of Chichén Itza, which again you can visit today. You have what's called the Great Ball Court. You have what's called the Observatory, Caracol. And so you have lots and lots of elements to this site in addition to the Castillo. And here is just a representation of what the cenote looks like underneath the Castillo. All right, I just wanted to point out that a very famous example of load-bearing architecture are the Great Pyramids of Menkaure, Khafre, and Khufu. And so we'll look at these in more detail in lesson, I think it's lesson 10 or 11, where we'll look at burial. So we'll be thinking about that in more detail, but I just wanted to show it to you very briefly. All right, beyond load-bearing architecture, we have what's called post and lintel construction. This is a very basic, as it says, basic post and lintel module. So you can use these, you can create multiple to create more complex structures. So you have arrows indicating the downward distribution of weight. And so the posts are on the sides, and then you have the lintel on top. And the key here is you don't want your posts too far apart or the lintel will crack, because you do have that downward pressure on the lintel. And still today, if you look at doorways around your home, you'll see this kind of post and lintel construction. And obviously architects can do very elaborate things. So again, you can make it more complicated, just like we saw with load-bearing architecture. So post and lintel construction is an ancient method of constructing walls, making openings and supporting a roof. And again, you just want to keep those posts not too far apart. And just remember that the posts are the things on the side and the lintel is the element on the top. So just keep that in mind. The example you probably thought of in your head is Stonehenge. So this is a very famous construction of post and lintel elements. And so you can see that it had originally, here I can show you the reconstruction. So it had this complete circle of post and lintel construction. Then it had these large trilithons, these 3-part constructions that were even larger than the outer circle. And then it also had what were called blue stones, these kind of more bluish gray stones that seem to have been brought from a greater distance from what modern day Wales. So you can see that this demonstrates a good understanding of engineering and architecture at a very early phase in England. Some people have theorized that it demonstrates the importance of stones, kind of a ritual quality to stone, a possible healing quality to stone, connections to the divine related to stone. We talk about this also in my Art 101 class when we talk about Neolithic culture. But essentially, what we definitely know is that it was created to think about the movement of the sun, right? So you can look at this image once again, and you have this idea that on the morning of the summer solstice, the sun would rise directly over what was called the heel stone. So you can see it here. And it would go right into that horseshoe shape of those larger trilithons, that larger construction. And so you can see that right over there. Good. All right, so let's think about how post and lintel construction can become increasingly complex. And so a good example of that would be Greek temple architecture, not pyramids, Greek temple architecture. So the most famous Greek temple is the Parthenon. And so the Parthenon was a temple dedicated to the goddess Athena Parthenos, or Athena as the maiden. And she was the patron goddess. Athena was the patron goddess of the city Athens. That makes sense, right? Athena, Athens. And so Athens, or Athena, was a goddess who was born from the head of Zeus. So Zeus produced her on his own. So she was really revered as this wise goddess, this goddess who was connected to Zeus, the leader of the Olympian gods. So she was very important. In any case, in the 5th century, the Athenians constructed a large number of structures. This was after what were called the Persian Wars or Persian invasions. And so they're really trying to build back very strongly, and Athens had access to a lot of money at that time. So they build this large temple, a very large temple that was extremely expensive. And essentially it's using that kind of post and lintel construction. So you can see how each of the circular columns, which was created with drums, so they would build up the marble drums one on top of the other, and then you have a lintel up on the top. So you can see that they're trying not to separate these columns too much because you don't want that lintel to crack, right? And when we're using a very expensive white marble, we don't want that marble to collapse, and we don't want anyone to get hurt. Inside this temple was a gold and ivory sculpture of Athena. It no longer survives, but it was said to have been quite beautiful. In any case, you wanted it to stand. You have a row of columns here. The term here is colonnade. And in this particular case, we have 8 columns on the front and 17 along the side, which was larger than other temples at the time. Again, very expensive. When we talk about the columns, people will often say there are different orders of the columns and orders of temple architecture. So it's important to know these terms. And this is something that if you go to Las Vegas, you're going to recognize how they are representing these styles in the architecture there. So the Parthenon uses what's called the Doric order. This is where you see a more simple column capital. You have what's called a fluted column. So you have these kind of ridges in the column. We can go back and you can see those ridges creating these shadows here. Again, very simple column capital. And the column sits directly on the base of the temple, which is called the stylobate. There's no extra decoration along the bottom. This was seen as a very strong and sometimes associated with being a more masculine order. So we can see that they're using the Doric order when they create the Parthenon. Unfortunately, the Parthenon is in pretty rough shape. It was housing some explosives that went off during a battle. And so it was already heavily it was in pretty rough shape, but this was really kind of the final straw. And then a lot of people came and eventually took sculptures from it later on. So it's had a pretty rough experience. In any case, we're seeing the Doric order. You can see that you can really get into the details of all the terminology. Some useful things to know are just stylobate, the base of the temple, the drum, those individual circles of the column, the capital, this upper portion of the column. And then in Doric order, we also have the alternation of what are called triglyphs, where you see these three lines, so triglyph, and then metopes, which were an area where sculpture could go. But you could see if you are an architecture major or you want to go into architecture or architectural history, you can get very, very detailed with knowing all of these different terms. I'm not going to quiz you on it, but if you want to, you can certainly explore. All right, and then there are two other orders that became well known during the Greek period and then were also picked up by the Romans, the ancient Romans. So we have the Ionic order, which does not have the triglyph metope alternation, but you can see it has a different capital that has curving volutes. So it has these kind of curving elements, and then it does have a base. You can see the column is still fluted, but with a slightly different type of fluting. And so that's a key difference there. The Corinthian order also does not have that triglyph metope alternation, and it has a very ornate capital. So you have these kind of peeling acanthus leaves, this peeling of leaves. Again, you have a fluting, but again, different from here. And you also have a base rather than the no base over in the Doric order. The Corinthian order was developed under the Greeks, but became very popular under the Romans. All right, let's think about what kind of architecture we see developing in Asian countries, especially East Asian countries or territories. This was called wood frame construction. The Chinese developed wood frame architecture based on the post and lintel model. So we have these posts that help to support these very large roofs. And the roofs really become an area for decoration, an area that really makes the architecture stand out, gives the architecture a lightness and almost a sense of wings coming out from the architecture. There's certain halls that are named things like Phoenix Hall because they look like a bird or they have bird-like elements. So you can see that they have non-load bearing walls, meaning that all the weight is directed into these posts, and you can see that it's very light and airy. You might have screens dividing up the space to make it more private, but the screens are not bearing the weight. All that weight is on the posts. We have these brackets, which look like upside down pyramids, which are essentially going from those load bearing posts up to the roof, which is very heavy because they tend to be very elaborate. And then we have these cantilevered eaves. So we have these elements that extend out to help to support the roof lines, which are really moving well beyond the posts themselves. So an example here, we can see the imperial palace of the Forbidden City. And so here we can just see how the roof line, here we have a double roof, extends quite broadly. And part of this was to protect, so these were generally made of wood, and so the great enemy, of course, is fire. So you want to have a kind of roof that maybe would protect, these wide eaves would protect some of that, those wood elements, those wood posts from fire. So within this large hall, this was part of the imperial residence of the Emperor of China in the city of Beijing when it functioned as the capital under the Ming and Qing dynasties. Here are some details just of different brackets, just to show you how it really can become a very interesting spot of decoration, a really beautiful part of the architectural construction, how you can add different colors and different kind of dramatic elements to these portions. And then you can see how the cantilevered eaves can become quite dramatic as well, where you get this rather exciting curvature that really adds to the decoration of the structure. You can even see a bit more of the brackets in this area here. All right, returning more to what we tend to see in Europe, we're going to look at arches, and so a single arch here, and then multiple arches are called arcades. So I always say, like, where do you go and play video games? It's arcades. So anyways, most people play video games at home, I guess. But anyways, in the old days, so a row of arches is an arcade, one arch is an arch. We have two different types here. We have a round arch and a pointed arch. So the round arch, you can see these individual stones are called voussoirs. I won't quiz you on that. In any case, you can see that round arches, these were very popular with the Romans. They tended to be able to hold a lot of weight. You can see an aqueduct. Aqueducts are very famous examples of Roman architecture. They were used to move water across the empire. Very popular in the Gothic period. So sometimes in my in-person class, I'll say, like, what does a pointed arch remind you of? And some people will say Gothic. That's really the answer I'm looking for. So that was a style very popular around 1200, 1300s. So that would be the 13th and 14th centuries in Europe, especially around the area of France. But some students will say Harry Potter. So, it just has kind of a Gothic and older look to it. And you can get these really wonderful effects to the ceiling as well through ribbed vaults. All right, so just thinking about vaulting, transitioning to vaulting, we have barrel vaults. We see that here in Santiago de Compostela, which was a Romanesque pilgrimage church. So the Romanesque style was popular before the Gothic style, and it tended to emphasize these smooth semicircular arches. If you're going to intersect two vaults, it's called a groin vault. This creates a more open and airy construction because you're kind of pulling up an element of the arch or of the vaulting. So just something to think about. This is a groin vault where you have those arches intersecting, and then this is a barrel vault up here. All right. We also have these ribbed groin vaults. So if we think about cathedrals, if we think about Gothic cathedrals especially, you have this application to the ridges of the groin vault, which look like ribs, like in a human body, and create this extra support for the structure. And it also creates a visual interest, right? So as you go into these Gothic cathedrals, there's what we call a strong vertical pull. So your eyes go up, you're thinking about the heavens. You're not thinking about what's going on in the terrestrial realm. You're thinking about the celestial realm. So having this kind of ornamentation that goes around these amazing windows as well, all of this can help direct your attention. So we've got the ribbed groin vault. Here I'm just doing a very quick comparison between ribbed groin vault and barrel vault. All right. Santiago de Compostela, where we saw the barrel vault, is over here on the far western side of Spain. And there you can see a ribbed groin vault here. A famous example, so in 2019, the Cathedral of Notre Dame, the church to Our Lady of Paris, or Our Lady in Paris. This was a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. This was the main cathedral of Paris. It burned. So perhaps you heard about this on the news. I'm just going to sip of water. Perhaps you heard about this on the news. So it reopened in 2024. And you can see how all of that vaulting was heavily damaged and or collapsed. But you can see some of that intersection here. So obviously this was a huge tragedy. This was a terrible loss. Luckily, the structure was able to be cleaned and conserved and brought back up to being used in under 5 years, which was really amazing. But because under that vaulting, there was wood supporting the structure, very old dry wood. And so that burned, thus damaging the stone vaulting system below. Okay, and there's just an image of this terrible tragedy. What's something else that we see in Gothic cathedrals? We see flying buttresses. So how are they able to create these very, very tall structures? They use these flying buttresses all around the structure. So these are the elements, kind of like half arches that extend out from the structure. So rather than having the support as part of the building itself, they add these flying buttresses to add support to the structure. This protects the structure from high winds, and it also allows it to get taller. And in addition to that, it allows it to have these beautiful stained glass windows. So just an example of the kind of stained glass windows that we see in Chartres Cathedral, also dedicated to Notre Dame or Our Lady, like we saw with the example in Paris that burned, but is now open again. So with these wonderful windows, you get this amazing spiritual light or kind of spiritual glow. And so all of that can be seen through the windows themselves. So this is very significant. All right, just a couple of views so you can see the kind of bumpy quality of those flying buttresses coming out from the structure. All right, just to finish up, we're going to look at two examples of modern methods for building. So there was a modernist architect named Mies van der Rohe. So modernism was a style that became very popular in the 20th century and was all about reducing excess decoration, kind of reducing things to what was necessary, and also removing what was considered excess ornament in some cases. Some people consider it very minimal. In this case, we're looking at a very famous skyscraper named the Seagram building. It's still in existence today in New York City. So this is a New York City structure. You can see in this early photograph, it's one of the few kind of high rises or few skyscrapers in this area, but today it's kind of swimming in a sea of skyscrapers. So Mies van der Rohe was a very important architect at this time. He built this in the 1950s. And this is only possible through steel frame construction. So steel frame construction allows for these types of skyscrapers to be constructed. When you're looking at a Gothic cathedral, we're using stone here, right? So through the use of stone, you can only go so high. They kept trying to build the Gothic cathedrals taller and taller. They started to collapse because they were building them so high. But with steel frame construction, you create this kind of skeleton in order to keep building and building and building. And cities continue to, and architects continue to try to defy physics by building these structures, as large as possible. So this is what the Seagram building looks like today. You can see it has this wonderful reflective quality. Even though people say modernism really doesn't have any ornament, if you get up close, you can see that there are some elements that Mies van der Rohe has added. He does kind of have this kind of black that he tends to use. And so you can see that there's this rhythmic patterning of some decoration, this kind of texture that he adds to the outside, these elements that emerge out. Some people have pointed out there's connections to Post-and-Lintel Construction as it was then adopted by the Greek temples, and then he's kind of simplifying that. You can see that he's clearly thinking about having areas out in front, allowing more space for walking around the base of the structure as well. And there's a huge amount of light. He's trying to bring light into the office structure. This building is well known as being incredibly energy inefficient because it's an older structure, so he's not really thinking about energy efficiency, but also there's so many windows. And so allowing all this light to come in isn't particularly energy efficient. So that is a modernist example. Here I'm just showing you, this is Los Angeles City Hall to give you a sense of how it looked with its steel frame and then as it's finished. All right, our last example is the Portland building from 1982 by Michael Graves. So here we're thinking about a style called postmodernism or postmodern architecture, which is really rejecting some of the simplicity and minimalism of modernism. So this is postmodernism. In this particular case, you're seeing an architect who was he really embraced color. He embraced a return to ornament and decoration, elements that weren't necessarily required for the structure. He embraced variety, so different types of window shapes, different types of color, elements that don't necessarily make sense, but seem to be maybe rooted in historical references in architecture. So here I'm just showing you a couple of different examples of Michael Graves structures. They always seem to employ different types of shapes, different sizes of windows, unusual forms combined together. So some people would say very 1980s, just with its embrace of color. So I always like to ask, what style do you prefer? Are you more interested in the kind of light-filled, simple minimalism, less ornament of Mies van der Rohe's Seagram building, or do you prefer the color and ornament of Michael Graves' Portland building of the 1980s? So as we conclude, you're going to have an exercise where you're going to look at this Gothic cathedral and think about what are some of the terms you could apply. So in this lesson, we looked at load-bearing architecture, also post-and-lintel construction, columns, colonnade, wood frame construction, brackets, arch, arcade, buttressing, different types of vault, and steel frame construction. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lecture.